A country at war with its children. 500 children were killed in just 6 months last year, Bigitseli told us. It could have been more because 1,000 cases of assault were opened with the police, and those are just the ones we know about. Many, as you might know, go unreported. In some cases, the kids disappear and are never seen again. Then there are those places where one would assume the kids are safe, the places where their trust is most cruelly broken, at school and in places of worship where the predators groom children and prepare them for sexual abuse, teachers, pastors, parents, uncles, aunties. Where can they turn to when it seems there is no safe place to go? What is the state of child protection in South Africa? Luke Lamprecht is my guest this morning. He's a child development and protection consultant. Luke, thank you so much for coming into the studio to talk about this unfortunate subject, right? Are we keeping our kids safe?
Look, I think at the moment our sort of history and track record with protecting children's rights in general, even based on the previous article about babies in cardboard boxes, is actually appalling. And I'm actually seeing almost a regression of the rights of children accessing protective services, and particularly after COVID. What we've noticed is that children, we can talk about child participation, Article 28 of the Constitution, but ultimately, if there's not an adult there to access a child's agency with them and assist to access their agency for them, children can't access them on their own. They're just simply referred away from hospitals, police stations, social workers, etc., because there's this idea that there needs to be an adult mediating it, when it's often the adults that have caused the problem that the children need protection from.
Just maybe let's take a step back. We're all too familiar with the scourge of gender-based violence and femicide. Would you say we now have a child abuse crisis in South Africa?
We have always had a child abuse crisis in South Africa, and I think what we are noticing now is that, particularly in a time like Child Protection Week, suddenly people start releasing statistics and the media picks up on articles. This is what I do 365 days a year. So this week, and what you are seeing is no different from any other week I see. It's just that there seems to be a lens on it. And the interesting thing about the lens is, while it raises awareness, what it does is it often just gives people this kind of short jolt of like, there's this outrage and people are enraged about what's happening, or people feel completely demoralized and saying, I don't know what we're going to do about it. But the reality is we've got to get up every day and we have got to fight this, because the truth is that, as I said in the introduction, is we need to be there to assist protecting children. The idea that they can protect themselves from us is just completely, it's completely mad.
Well, what I hope this conversation could also do is create awareness for people to know what to look out for, right? I spoke about the breaking of trust in my introduction. Can you explain the concept of grooming, for example?
So the first warning to all parents, if you want to pick up on the first sign of grooming, if someone is paying more attention to your child than you have a problem. Okay, so that's number one. What these people do is they get themselves into positions of trust with the institution. They have to be employed first. So in other words, they've got to be employed as a coach or an educator, and they've got to get the trust of that institution. Once they've got the trust of that institution, they have to get the trust of the parents who drop their children off there. Then they need to get the trust of the child. And they do that first through creating favorites. Now, people will often say it's children who are vulnerable who are made the favorites. Yeah. But actually, it's also children who have got enormous potential, for example, enormous sporting potential. So it almost makes sense that you create this
favor. Justifiable in a way.
Justifiable. It creates this idea, I'm actually getting this young person ready for his career, in sport, and I'm giving him extra attention.
And gosh, how many successful athletes, right, have said somebody saw something special in me when I was a little kid, and without the attentions of coach or teacher or so-and-so, I wouldn't be here. So that's what parents think is going on.
And parents buy into it because parents like the idea that my child is going to one of the correct. And we're also looking at this particular LSM is unlike the one with the babies in the cardboard boxes. These are wealthy people because there's a level at which they give access to privilege later on, whether it's, kind of Springbok rugby or Olympic swimming, whatever it is. There's that sense that you are favored. Then they isolate them from people. So, for example, there'll be private lessons, come to my house, individual trips like we had in the St. Andrew's case, individual trips in a car, to help the boy because he's battling. And then the two most important ones to understand are boundary violations. And a boundary violation by an adult is, for example, sending WhatsApps to individual children where they are talking colloquially in the slang of the teenagers rather than the 50-year-old coach that they are. So they blur the professional personal boundary. Okay.
So the child feels like this is a friend, this is somebody who relates to me, this is not, a fuddy-duddy, older person. They really get me. They really get what it's like.
Spot on, especially at a time when they're moving away from their parents in adolescence, which is a normal developmental phase. And in particular, when they are sent away from their parents, for example, to boarding facilities where we have huge challenges around keeping children safe. And then the most important one is the one we need to always tell our children about is then there is a thing called a taboo violation. So what these people do is they not only allow children to do things other responsible adults wouldn't, they facilitate it, for example, buy the alcohol and participate in it with the children. So what happens is the children are doing something that their parents or the principal of the school would say, that's terrible, you've got to stop it. These guys are actually facilitating it. And once they get that level of taboo violation as almost like a code of silence with the child, there's that level of secrecy associated.
We've done one thing wrong before together, so we can graduate to something else.
And the child won't speak because the child feels at some level they have participated and as a result will be blamed. And then once that happens, there's all of that happening, and the groomer is sort of testing at each phase if they can sort of proceed. And once they get to that last phase and they introduce, for example, I've seen in every case I've dealt with boys who've been abused, alcohol and pornography, they are completely intertwined in this. And once they get to that point and they're abused, then you get all of the disincentives to disclosure, which keeps the secrets. Starting at a simple thing like snitches get stitches and end up in ditches. So an entire code of secrecy in the school, for example, or the boarding, allows for the pathology. Because remember, the power of abuse is the secret.
Snitches
get stitches and end up in ditches.
And so there's the pressure that I won't. Is it also because there usually are other kids? It's not usually one kid. They're usually, so I don't want to be the snitch that broke the silence when seemingly the others are able to keep a secret.
And interestingly, at various levels. So what happens, there's levels of the secret. So you'll have a simple secret around things like, this is a particular strategy in our rugby game. Then you'll have another layer of a secret, which is these arbitrary things that are done, for example, in orientations or initiations, like diving for stones that you can't find. It's just arbitrary. And then you've got criminality, kind of pornography, grooming, sexual assault, etc.
Many parents will think, it wouldn't happen to my child. I've prepared my child. We've had conversations. And of course, often it does. How do you warn your child? Well, how do you prepare children to navigate a world like this?
The first thing is that you must understand that a parent's relationship with their child is the single greatest protective feature for their child against pretty much everything. I'm talking about things like substance abuse, any kind of danger, sexual abuse, etc. Because the ability, despite your children's protests, even as teenagers, to be able to give them a vocabulary, and we give them wrong vocabularies. For example, we say to children, if someone tries to touch you, yell, or ask you to do this, you must just say no. In what context does a parent ever allow a child to say no to a powerful, trusted adult, other than when the adult is trying to touch them on their private parts? There is no context. In fact, what we do is we override children's saying no in context, like, for example, kissing your grandmother, and it's your mother-in-law, and if, the child doesn't kiss granny, she's going to think you're a bad mother and a bad wife, so you better kiss your granny. And we actually override children saying no. So it starts with basic things. Their children have agency, they need a vocabulary, so in other other words, they need to be given this vocabulary to have this conversation. And then finally, and something that's come out, for example, in the Ackerman trial, which you've been covering in a lot of detail, that Kennedy Ackerman trial, is the internet is so dangerous for boundary blurring and for taboo violations, because the advent of the smartphone has not made pornography accessible, it's made it inevitable. And I'm seeing children present to me who have not been touched by anybody, but present with the traumatic sexualization symptoms of an abused child, based purely on what they're exposed to on pornography. And then they act it out, and the children end up with me as accused persons in sexual assault matters.
Gosh, we've seen alleged abusers accused in one environment, one school, perhaps in a different province, a different part of the country, popping up elsewhere. Where are we in terms of registers and being able to make sure that schools know exactly who it is they're hiring?
Yeah. Look, the registers are a nightmare. Accessing them is difficult. We don't know how up to date they are. We don't know whose names are there, because, for example, I employ you to teach my child archery or whatever. I'm not allowed to check the register, but I employ you. Only your employer is allowed to check the register, but you employ yourself because you're a sole proprietor. So how does that work? So the registers, you must not think the register is the be-all and end-all. Your observation of your child, the people around your child, and your conversations with your child is what you need to pay attention to. Do not rely on legislation and the government to protect your children. Even if you look at babies in boxes, there's a level of general neglect of children in the system. You as parents need to step up. Being a parent is not like joining the EFC. You can't tap out.
You said that's the ultimate differentiator in what happens to your child and the safety and protection of your child. Luke Lamprecht, you've given us some food for thought. Thank you very much for popping in this Child Protection Week. Luke Lamprecht, of course, is a child development and protection consultant.
Current events, developing stories,
tough questions.
Your voice making a difference.
This is Breakfast with Bongani Bingwa.